Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Beloit College. Welcome to our 16th annual Weissberg Chair and Human Rights Address. Tonight, we are particularly honored to be joined by our new friend and current Weissberg Chairholder, Susan Bissell, Chief of UNICEF's Child Protection Section and one of this country's most important protectors of children's rights. If you have not been to many campuses, you might think that every school has the equivalent of a Weissberg week. You might think that's such a smart idea, namely bringing someone to campus to interact with faculty, students, and staff, someone with a worldwide reputation for promoting core issues of human rights, someone with a proven record of stimulating effective change in a world too often antagonistic to such change, bringing someone to campus who has lived such a life of purposeful consequence, bringing someone to campus not for an arm's length visit, a drive-by lecture, collect my speaker's fee and on to the next college, to bring someone to campus for a full contact tour of duty. You can sleep next week, tour of duty. You might think that such a smart idea would be everywhere, at Lawrence, at Williams, at Middlebury, at Yale, at the University of Toronto. But you would be wrong. Only Beloit College has a Weissberg week, and because of that, a disproportionate share of human rights leaders, people who have committed themselves to a life of understanding and acting on their understanding, that vigilance in ensuring basic human rights for all humans is central to being human. A disproportionate share of these people like Susan Bissell, have found their way to the Weissberg Chair, and from there to this podium, this night, this chance to be with you. And this does not happen by accident. It starts with the college's mission, whose glorious first sentence reads, Beloit College engages the intelligence, imagination, and curiosity of its students, empowering them to lead fulfilling lives marked by high achievement, personal responsibility, and public contribution in a diverse society. A mission which has wonderfully found purchase in one of our graduates and her father, Nina and Marvin Weissberg, a mission potentiated through their generous support of the Weissberg Program, a mission personified this week in Susan Bissell, who somehow is living and has lived the Beloit College mission, even though she went to some other school. A testimony to Susan's perseverance in overcoming adversity. We are so fortunate, Susan Bissell, to have you here this week. I deeply hope that 50% of your way through the Weissberg Week Odyssey, you are enmeshed in the Beloiter vibe. And when you make it to the end of the day on Saturday, you will have found your time at Beloit to be time well spent. For your time here, Susan, and more broadly, for this week, we have to pause and thank two whom I just mentioned, Marvin and Nina Weissberg, the two whose vision, enthusiasm, and philanthropy makes this college and this world better. I hear they are watching from afar. Thank you both. There are three others I want to recognize who also make this week possible each year. Our Manger Family Professor of International Relations, Beth Doherty, our Director of International Education, Betsy Brewer, and our Associate Director of International Education, Josh Moore. It is their tenacity and focus on the importance of an undergraduate education at Beloit College that emphasizes the integration of internationalism into every department, and program on campus, a mission that is at the heart of the Weissberg residency that helped earn Beloit College the Senator Paul Simon Award for Campus Internationalization. Please join me in thanking Beth, Betsy, and Josh for developing and implementing a framework that makes the most of this precious opportunity and that promotes the mission of this great school so effectively. It is terrific to see so many of you with us here tonight. Let me turn over the podium to Professor Beth Doherty, who will properly introduce our featured speaker and honored Weissberg chairholder, Susan Bissell. Beth.
I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. While I have your attention, I just want to tell you what the remainder of the week will look like. For students, tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock in WAC North Lounge, Susan will be speaking about tips for careers in human rights and social justice advocacy. On Friday at 4 o'clock in Richardson, there will be a panel discussion with a number of Beloit College faculty looking at things like language rights for Roma children, adolescent motherhood, child soldiering, child labor, etc. And then at 7:30 in Richardson, we will be film screening a documentary that Susan was instrumental in making called A Kind of Childhood, which is about child labor issues. And then on Saturday, April 2nd, we're having a community forum on at-risk children and youth in Rock County. And it's meant to be an effort to talk about possible solutions to helping those who are at risk in our own locale. Susan Bissell has spent her career working for the rights of children. She has spent over 25 years working in various capacity for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. And in January of 2016, she was named director of UNICEF's Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. The primary purpose of the partnership is to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, all forms of violence, and torture of children. From 2009 to 2015, Dr. Bissell served as Chief of Child Protection in UNICEF's Program Division. She is the author of a number of research studies. She's worked in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, India, Italy, New York City. She earned a PhD in public health and medical anthropology from the University of Melbourne in Australia. While she was completing her doctorate, she joined Trudy Styler and the Bangladeshi film team Catherine and Tarek Masood to produce the documentary we'll show on Friday night, A Kind of Childhood, which has won awards and been screened widely. She holds a master's degree in law, economics, and international relations from the University of Toronto. On behalf of her UNICEF Child Protection colleagues, Susan has accepted awards including an honorary professorship at Barnard College, Columbia University, the Dr. John Meyer Global Citizenship Award from Tufts University, the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, and of course, the Weissberg Chair in International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Susan Bissell.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know when I last spoke in a chapel, so I'm feeling I don't actually get nervous when I talk, but there's something about being in a chapel. I want to start by thanking you very much for this tremendous honor. I accepted this chair, as with the other awards, on behalf of my colleagues in UNICEF and in other organizations working for children all over the world. And what I've seen already in being here just a couple of days is that there's a great connection between that work that my colleagues do and this wonderful institution, Beloit College, as it, and I quote, prepares students to engage critically with human rights and defend human dignity. Spending this week among students and faculty is actually quite humbling. There are so many bright and engaged young minds here, buoyed along by dedicated staff. Indeed, as a career public servant in these first 3 days on campus, I am starkly reminded that the Academy has a major role to play in preparing the next generation to tackle the enormous challenges that children face now and are sure to face in the coming generations. To the Weissberg family, and I look forward to meeting you, Nina, my deepest gratitude. What vision the Weissberg family has. As I read about your commitment to the chair and the program, I was reminded of a conversation I had with Buddy Frank, Anne Frank's last surviving cousin, who I met with in Zurich last year. I told him about the work being done in all parts of the world to protect children from violence, exploitation, abuse, and neglect. And he posited, and I quote, "Susan, it's an enormous mountain of problems. Where do you start?" And my reply to him resonates with what this chair and program are all about: infusing young minds with the passion for and interest in traversing that enormous mountain. If not all of us to think about our world and the ways to make it better, then who? I'm going to speak with you this evening about the rights of children, and at the risk, and I mentioned this today in a couple of classes, at the risk of putting you all to sleep, I'm going to take you back more than 25 years to the final days of the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And if you'll indulge me in a few moments of UN reflection, I'll tell you a little bit about the way in which the United Nations is set up to defend and safeguard the rights of children. I'll then turn to a number of challenges that children face today, in particular their protection around the world or lack thereof. Later, and by way of concluding, I will talk about violence in childhood, a child rights dilemma plaguing us all, and something at the heart of the new goals, Agenda 2030, which the world has set for itself. So on the rights of children, Saturday morning, just this past Saturday, I had a call with a journalist here in Beloit. He was anticipating my visit, and I was very excited to receive his call. We actually got the timing wrong because of the time difference between New York and Beloit. Anyway, he said to me right off the bat in the interview, "Do children really have rights?" And it was a brilliant question. When you work for UNICEF for 25 years and when your entire career has grown from the drafting of the UN Convention focused entirely on the rights of children, you never ask yourself whether children have rights or not. So this query from a journalist reminded me that undoubtedly, for most people, the notion of children actually being rights holders is a foreign one. For many, children are dependents. They lack agentive capacity. They do not vote, are seen as property in parts of our world, or are seen as mini adults. As an aside, there is an ongoing bit of humor among my colleagues that I used to be a big child rights proponent, and then I had my own child, who is now 16, and that triggered a rethinking of the whole child rights thing. Details on that for another lecture. And my apologies, actually, to Jasmine, my daughter, for invoking her so often in my remarks on campus these past few days. It has been hard not to think of her. I see in the student body here the same promise, the same passion, and potential. You young people here in Beloit and across the globe are our and your hope for humanity. But back to the convention, the most widely and rapidly ratified convention in history. It is a treaty that covers children's economic, social, political, and cultural rights. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as we've been discussing over the past few days, has 4 general principles of its implementation. And the first general principle is non-discrimination. It applies to all children everywhere. The second principle is the right to survival. These are in no particular order, but the right to survival, that's the very basic principle of the convention. After we help children survive, we can do many other things. A third general principle of the convention is the best interests of the child are to prevail in all matters affecting them. Not the best interest of the state, not the best interest of the family, but the best interest of the child. And the final general principle of the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the right of a child to participate in decisions affecting them according to their evolving capacity. Governments, non-governmental organizations, and UN agencies took part in drafting the convention. It took 10 years for those drafters to agree on the content of this very important treaty. And what I'm dying to tell you is that during that process, and in the last 2 years of its drafting, I was the chief photocopier in residence. I was 24 years old. I had a newly minted undergraduate degree. I did suffer the adversity of the University of Toronto. I wasn't at Beloit. But I arrived in New York from Toronto to take up an internship with UNICEF. So my job was photocopying all these documents so that the drafters had what they needed to get the job done. And I think I was pretty good at it, because at the end of my 3-month internship, I was actually offered a job. Thank goodness, in time, I was able to pay my parents back the money they lent me to do the internship. And at that time, and even to this day, I am gripped by the mission of this incredible organization. And there has, to coin a phrase, been no looking back. Now, I'm not sure one needs to be obsessed with children or obsessed with the law to get this excited about an international human rights treaty. But for those of us concerned with the protection of the world's children, this was a groundbreaking movement in international human rights and a groundbreaking piece of legislation. It still is. So let me share with you a few facts about the convention. Children in this international human rights treaty are defined as those under the age of 18. There are articles in the convention about child labor, trafficking, children and war. Other articles touch upon children having a voice in decisions affecting them. The convention mentions the right to a name and a nationality. And Article 4 of 54 articles of the convention calls upon states parties to allocate resources to realize the rights of children domestically and also for their assistance to other countries. I'm sure you're sitting on the edges of your seat now, but even more gripping is the fact that there are now 3 optional protocols to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we've talked about some of them in the classes we've been in. These protocols are proof that the convention, or in other terms, this law, is very much a live document. It's morphing and adapting to the societies and realities it occupies. One protocol refers to the sale of children, child prostitution, and pornography. A second optional protocol refers to children in armed conflict. And the third and most recent protocol creates a complaints mechanism for individual children. So if they can't remedy something that is a violation of their rights in their own countries and communities, as a last resort, they can actually present their complaint to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in Geneva. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the convention forces us or allows or encourages us to see children in a different way. They are human beings with their own rights. In countries the world over, the convention and its relationship to national and state or provincial legislation has triggered a process of social change. This is especially true when one looks at contexts where domestic law reform involves public discourse and public debate. When citizens, including young people themselves, discuss issues and give voice to matters affecting children with a view to possibly even codifying them, things start to change. Examples of this are endless, but I want to share 2 of these with you, each at the opposite ends of the political, cultural, and geographic spectrums. For the first example, travel with me to a small Nordic country with a manageably sized population and admittedly socialist politics. This country, hint, they speak Swedish here, decides that all forms of corporal punishment against children must be stopped. There is much public discussion, laws are reformed, information flows about this new legislation, and over the course of a generation, the practice of beating, berating, and degrading children to punish them ends. I don't want to debate cause and effect here, and I'm most certainly simplifying what it takes for social change to be cemented in a culture, but suffices to say, public and dialogue-informed law reform has a role to play in social change. The second example takes us to South Asia and an amazing country of countries, India, where I spent part of my UNICEF career. I imagine many of you will recall the gang rapes that were reported in December 2012 on a bus in New Delhi. Sexual violence is neither new in nor exclusive to India. However, this particular case in New Delhi brought with it national public outrage. 120 million girls all over the world experienced sexual violence last year and in 2014. However, it was in India that students protested on campuses across the country. I would argue that this was at the very least linked to the rapid turnaround of the Verma Commission that was reviewing this particular case and Indian legislation, and that in part responsible for some important changes in Indian law on the rape of women and girls. Has sexual violence ceased in India? Most certainly not. As this abhorrent form of violence continues, including on college campuses across the United States, in the Indian case, it is arguable that social change is emerging in the context of this crime for the first time in Indian history. It will necessarily need to be accompanied by changes in attitudes towards women and girls, in addition to addressing other aspects of discrimination and inequality that prevail in far too many places around the world. Ending impunity is and will continue to be of prime importance. Now, a final comment from me on this sort of general look at children's rights, rhetoric, and reality. It is absolutely true that enormous gaps exist, huge, as Bernie Sanders would say, between the national legal reforms that have followed the ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and practice. These gaps often have less to do with the words on paper than with the political will, the financial and human resources needed to make change happen. Laws have to be resourced and implemented, and where I see the biggest omission and the greatest inaction are places, even with functioning democracies, where the social construction of childhood is stuck in time. In these places, of which there are far too many, children's lack of political voice translates for policymakers and politicians into inaction. As mentioned earlier, Article 4 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child states that they must allocate resources for children to the maximum extent possible. That is all too often far too big a loophole. How long is a piece of string is pretty much synonymous with to the maximum extent possible. The rights of children, I argue and will continue to argue, are not an add-on or something to factor into what is left over at the end of budget talks. Front and center is where children and their rights should be. So this inertia, I want to ponder on that and the loopholes that exist, and they exist pretty much everywhere in the world. Who makes things happen for children? Who creates change, and how? Just as it takes a village to raise a child, it takes an international community to save and protect children. I'll turn to government and civil society organizations in a moment, and will lead with the United Nations in my remarks. Rest assured, I hasten to add, I'm not making a plea for the UN as an unflawed, perfectly effective, always doing the right thing institution. It most certainly is not. I am saying, though, having had a frontline view of UNICEF in action in a number of countries, I remain convinced that the world would be a worse place without at least this complex, well-intentioned bureaucracy. I am equally convinced that we can do better in partnership. UNICEF is the leading UN agency when it comes to children. Born in the aftermath of the Second World War, UNICEF was the International Children's Emergency Fund. That's what the letters stand for. The late and very dignified Audrey Hepburn, a Goodwill Ambassador for UNICEF, herself recalled benefiting from milk that UNICEF delivered to she and other children after the war. And there are many, many elderly people in Japan who hold UNICEF very dear to their hearts to this very day, for the food supplies they received from the organization when they were children. This fund related to but financially independent from the UN, and we've talked a bit about that in classes, has evolved from that supply-driven, emergency-focused mission to one which embraces human rights, the rights of children in particular, in all settings. Other UN agencies also have the rights of children within their mandates. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has a special interest in statelessness and children and the best interest determination in the context of separated and unaccompanied migrant children, something we're seeing all too often in the news today. The Office of the High Commission for Human Rights is home to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. This is the 18-member body of experts that oversees implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. ILO, the International Labor Organization, leads on child labor and the implementation of two particular conventions, ILO Convention 138 and 182. The UN Office for Drugs and Crime has a special focus on child trafficking, and DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping at the UN, has a hand in the work to keep children safe in war-affected settings. The UN Fund for Population Activity, UNFPA, works with UNICEF and others on issues such as female genital mutilation and cutting and child marriage. And finally, but in no way exhaustively, WHO, the World Health Organization, addresses a range of child health issues, most recently including non-communicable diseases and, importantly, violence. And I quote in their most recent resolution, violence against women and girls and children. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but there's quite a particular story why it was women and girls and children, and we all came out victorious in that, I think. It's fair to say that there is an unprecedented high-level commitment from the current Secretary General to issues important to the lives of the world's children. I'm reminded of a meeting I attended not long after transferring to New York from the Research Center in Italy a few years ago, and that meeting was with the Secretary General, together with the chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and the New York-based representative of the Holy See. We were to discuss sexual abuse and the church. When I left the meeting, I remember looking across the lawns of the United Nations to the East River, thinking how incredibly historic that moment would be to millions of victims and to the future protection of millions of children. The UN also has a never-before-seen list of special representatives of the Secretary General and special rapporteurs that are advocating for children. There is a special representative of the Secretary General on children and conflict, another on children and violence, and a third on sexual violence and conflict. Special rapporteurs on education, health, torture, trafficking and the sale of children, nutrition, and a litany of other child-related issues work on an unpaid basis to sustain the interest of states parties in fulfilling their obligations and to apply some pressure as is often needed. You've heard me use the word partnership quite a bit, and at the end of my remarks, I'm going to talk about the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. It's crucial. In every country where I've been posted, local civil society organizations have been on the ground, at the forefront, and are there to stay. They go places others will not, speak truths that others will not, and are there for the long haul. I have met some amazing people with incredible dedication in these organizations, and they have indulged me as I have learned and grown in my career. Time is too limited to name all the names, but I have the strongest recollection of working with the late Salma Soban and Hamida Hussain in Dhaka, Bangladesh. They, together with Tarek and Catherine, who Beth mentioned, taught me firsthand about the complexities and intricacies of childhood in a place like Bangladesh. Salma and Hamida had a grassroots organization working with urban, slum, and street children. It was called Aino Shalish Kendra. And I want to illustrate just a little bit what kind of impact a small, local grassroots organization can have. Aino Shalish Kendra tackled a problem too big for any UN agency. Street children in Dhaka were being picked up by the police, brutalized, raped, and even made to disappear in some instances. Unable to get officials to crack down on law enforcement, Selma and Hamida studied the problem, and what they saw was that the children on the streets who had some kind of identity, a card, a birth certificate, anything stating that someone knew them or they were attached to someone, were not harassed. Children without identification were victimized. I know Shailesh Kendra could not swiftly reform a defunct civil registration and vital statistics system, but they could produce ID cards, and that they did. These were small laminated cards with the child's name, some identifying features, and the address and phone number of the NGO on the back. And the message to law enforcement and harassers was clear: if this child goes missing or is hurt, someone will be looking for them or her, him or her, and you will be held accountable for any harm. This is but one example of civil society in action. International non-government organizations are powerfully important too. In addition to community-level access, unlike UNICEF as a government-to-government body, NGOs have an enviable nimbleness and freedom. They can, among other things, work alongside the faith-based community. I'm thinking in particular of World Vision, for example. Others, like SOS Children's Villages, take up very specific issues, such as creating permanent family-like environments for children without parental care, and we talked about that in one of the classes today. Save, Plan, Tear Days Home, and the Child Fund Alliance are others in the civil society, or NGO world, as we call it, that are doing powerful and important work in the lives of children. And in contrast to UNICEF, many of them are operational in high-income settings, shedding a light on children who bear the brunt of inequity in these societies. It's been a great honor for me in my career to work alongside these organizations and to learn from the people with them as well. Now, what you heard in the very generous introduction at the beginning, my career has largely focused on what was, when I joined UNICEF, a very non-traditional field of work, where UNICEF started delivering emergency food and medical supplies. It actually developed into an organization with child survival at its core, and it's now known as the United Nations Children's Fund. Under the leadership of the wonderful visionary Jim Grant, growth monitoring, oral rehydration, breastfeeding, and immunization, or GOBI as it was called, became the mainstays. Arguably, nothing had done more to save the world's children than the investments in and delivery of vaccines. The global partnership, Gavi, the Global Vaccine Initiative, has a great deal to be credited with, and it's actually the model for the new partnership I'm setting up. For someone like me, however, who entered into this work in the final days of the drafting of the Convention on all the rights of all children, I was unsatisfied. My first field posting was in Sri Lanka, and there was a real war going on there. Its impacts on children were devastating. Villages were being massacred not once, but twice. Children living with disabilities were suffering exponentially. And if you allow me to digress, I wanted to share with you a memory of visiting a remote village where a child living with cerebral palsy, so this is a remote village in Sri Lanka, halfway between Colombo and Jaffna. And there was a child living with cerebral palsy who was locked in a shed day in and day out. His food was slipped under the door. He was about 8 years old. His parents were not horrible people. They were told he was cursed. They did not know what to do with him. And with the war raging on, there was little access for experts or even paraprofessionals to reach him. I remember almost to the day when I knew this is it. I knew that just saving children would never be enough for me. Save children from preventable diseases, yes, absolutely. But then and now I have a conviction that we must help children live completely, wholly, safely, and with dignity. Lest this sounds heroic or crazy, on some level, at about the same time, UNICEF got its first executive board paper on children in especially difficult circumstances, or CEDC, lots of acronyms in the UN, by the way, There were people in that boardroom in 1986 reading that board paper who learned about children as soldiers, children on the streets in Latin America, and children in brothels in South Asia. If those were transformative years for me, they were profoundly transformative for UNICEF. By 1996, the seminal study by Graça Machel, wife of Nelson Mandela, for the United Nations Secretary General was published. Graça Machel shone a spotlight on the horrific impacts of war on children. She wrote of their recruitment and use as soldiers, of the sexual violence they experienced, of their killing and maiming. What ensued was extraordinary commitment of the UN and the Security Council to the protection of children in war and from war. The Secretary General at that point established a new position of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on children in armed conflict. This is a position occupied today by a dynamic Algerian child rights advocate and human rights lawyer, Leila Zerougi. The creation of this office accompanied a litany of Security Council resolutions on the impacts of war on children, including perhaps the most important of those resolutions, Security Council Resolution 1612. This is a resolution that allows the Secretary General to name and shame parties to conflict and that holds them accountable for ending violence and crimes against children. Interestingly, UNICEF's work to protect children from violence is the only part of UNICEF's mandate that is considered and guided by the Security Council via, in particular, the Security Council Working Group on Children in Armed Conflict. 10 years later, so 2006, again at the behest of the Secretary General, this time Brazilian lawyer, Brown professor, and a human rights advocate, Paulo Sergio Panero, completed a global study on children and violence. As with the Machel study, he forced for the Secretary General a discussion at the UN on violence in children, this time in all settings, with the exception of war-torn environments. I was fortunate to have been part of the editorial board of that study, and rest assured there were some tense moments in the write-up. Taking a public health and human rights approach to violence against children, the study suggested that violence knows neither geographic nor cultural boundaries. It cuts across all income settings, is experienced by boys and girls and LGBTQ young people, and those living with and without disabilities. It painted a grim picture, but concluded that violence is neither justifiable nor an inevitable part of life. Violence against children is preventable. That study was published just prior to the adoption of UNICEF's first board strategy on child protection. If you can imagine, that was just in May 2008. In 2009, just after I came to UNICEF headquarters, the organization began to embrace that strategy and to make sense of it. That was my job. Get people embracing it and making sense of it, operationalize it. I'll come back to that strategy in a minute, but I'd actually like to just take a couple seconds, and we did this in one of the classes, but I want to do it so more of you get a chance to sleep on this tonight before we interact some more in class here. There are actually 3 streams of international law that are relevant to the protection of children from violence, abuse, exploitation, and neglect. And the reason I want to dwell on this is it's really unique. First of all, and these are in no particular order, we have international human rights law. And this is what we're calling public law in the context of children's rights. So that's where the Convention on the Rights of the Child sits. But there are other public law conventions, such as the Palermo Protocol on Human Trafficking. These are powerful, powerful instruments open for state party ratification, and they form a sort of reference point for advocacy and for action. International humanitarian law is also crucial to this work. IHL, another acronym. It's known in our world to apply in situations of conflicts. We have, for example, 4 Geneva Conventions that are particularly relevant. And what they do is they aim to limit the impacts of armed conflict, in particular on civilians. Within international humanitarian law, we find powerful calls for humanitarian access during times of war so that supplies and other resources can reach families and children in distress. And the best and most vivid and current example of that is the humanitarian access that we had to negotiate to maintain a UNICEF presence in Syria. The third legal stream that is important as we address violence, exploitation, and abuse is private international law, and I think we don't often think about that. In this regard, I'm referring specifically to the 3 Hague Conventions that address child protection, child abduction, and intercountry adoption. Private law has neither a humanitarian focus nor universal applicability. It is law that binds 2 countries calling for their agreement on matters in particular of jurisdiction, but other matters too. And I wanted to take a moment to take a closer look at intercountry adoption. And I'm going to quote from the US State Department website to bring this example home for all of you that are Americans here in the room. The Hague Convention applies to all adoptions by American citizens habitually resident in the United States of children habitually resident in any country outside of the United States that is a party to the Hague Convention. Adopting a child from a convention country is similar in many ways to adopting a child from a country not party to the convention. However, there are some key differences. In particular, those seeking to adopt may receive greater protection if they adopt from a Hague Convention country. This is really important, and again, something else we've been talking about in class. The Hague Convention requires countries who are party to it to establish a central authority to be the authoritative source of information and point of contact in that country. And here in the United States, your point of contact is the State Department and U.S. Ambassador for Children's Issues, Susan Jacobs. It aims to prevent abduction, sale of, or trafficking of children, and works to ensure that intercountry adoptions are in the best interests of the children concerned. The convention recognizes intercountry adoption as a means of offering the advantage of a permanent home to a child when a suitable family has not been found in the child's country of origin. It enables intercountry adoption to take place when certain steps have been followed. End of legal lecture. I want to come back to the strategy for a minute and just talk about the 2 sort of pillars of it that have been prioritized. And it's not just a strategy that applies to UNICEF work, but the strategy also applies to the partners that we work with. And it was written at a time when UNICEF and the major civil society organizations that I've mentioned and many governments in the world were together realizing that piecemeal and issue-by-issue approaches are not entirely effective. And when I say effective, I mean both from the perspective of cost and from the perspective of creating sustained change. The best example of this call for a systemic approach and more emphasis on prevention was actually well addressed this week in the panel on child trafficking that was held here. Rescuing and re-rescuing child victims without looking at why children are being trafficked to begin with is simply neither smart nor effective. And of course, I'm not advocating for not rescuing child victims. Shifting focus to establishing and/or strengthening systems from social welfare to justice to law enforcement to health and education continue to be crucial. These systems can and must address both prevention and response. At the same time, though, there are harms to children, perhaps most of their experiences of violence, that are not fixed by service delivery or remedied by service delivery in isolation from what I'm going to call here this evening social determinants. By social determinants, I mean social norms, societal attitudes and practices, and societal acceptance of various forms of violence against children. There are endless examples, and I'm sure you could come up with a few of your own. In some countries, the norm is the abandonment of children born out of wedlock or with a disability. When we see norms change, we see families raising children with disabilities appropriately counseled by medical and social welfare practitioners, and we see those parents and families not shunned by their neighbors and extended family, but rather they are accepted. The same holds true in communities that will exclude young single mothers. Let's say a 15-year-old girl who has been herself a victim of sexual violence and has the baby. In so many cases that I've seen, she is isolated and abandoned by her own family, and she struggles to raise her own child. The community can be changed by community members from the inside out to accept her and go further to be supportive and helpful. There are countless other examples of socially determined practices which rely on changing attitudes and behaviors. Think of child marriage, female genital mutilation and cutting, corporal punishment, and the stoning of women and girls to death in some parts of the world. Suffices to say that it is really not expensive to change these kinds of practices. They depend on people. But at the same time, these practices are deeply embedded in families, communities, and societies. So, and it's been my experience, change is tougher than it looks. It can take a generation or more. The best two examples of this are foot binding in China and the corporal punishment example in Sweden, which I mentioned earlier. These are two practices that are now historic, but not without decades of effort, law reform, public discussion, and campaigns. As a brief aside, I wanted to tell you that all the work I'm talking about takes part in two pretty starkly different settings. Humanitarian settings, on one hand, are contexts where there is conflict or natural disaster or some combination of both. By contrast, the situations outside of war and disaster have historically been called development settings. So you either work as a humanitarian actor or you work as a development actor. But what we're coming to see now is that the use of the word development is irrelevant. All countries are developing economically in one way or another. Development used to mean rich countries of the north versus poor countries of the south. Data now tells us that by 2020, most of the most marginalized children of the world will live in middle and high-income countries. We may end up with the terminology of humanitarian and non-humanitarian settings, and that would be what I would be advocating for, lowering the north-south divide. This is part of the spirit of the post-2015 goals and Agenda 2030. The so-called playing field is being leveled as an increasing number of countries become middle and high income, and as countries the world over, irrespective of income, find they have shared challenges and can share solutions to these challenges. And this is a perfect segue to the role in which I'm speaking to you this evening and the vantage point from which I've been interacting with faculty and students here. As you now know, and you've probably heard far too many times, I am the founding director of a new global partnership that's being established to serve as a means of implementation of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. Child Fund Alliance, World Vision, SOS Children's Villages, Plan, Save, and a number of other NGOs are a big part of the inception phase of this new initiative. Likewise, WHO has played a major role, and we're generously supported by a number of governments and by a small group of foundations that refer to themselves as Elevate Children. Violence is a phenomenon that impacts children in every country, including in the United States and including in my home country of Canada. And to the point of this being a global problem, I actually had the great privilege of returning to Sri Lanka about 2.5 weeks ago now, the country that was immersed in war when I started my career there 25 years ago. And during the few days I was in Colombo, I was consulting with Sri Lankan officials and others from throughout the region of South Asia on violence against children. Though the war has ended in Sri Lanka, I listened to story after story of sexual violence, child trafficking, child labor, online violence of a peer-to-peer nature, and other examples. So indeed, there is peace for Sri Lanka, but for countless children, there is no freedom from fear. Globally, the statistics are staggering. Every 5 minutes, a child dies as a result of violence. As I said already, an estimated 120 million girls and 73 million boys have been victims of sexual violence. And according to a recent study published by some experts from the Center for Disease Control in the journal Pediatrics, roughly 1 billion children between the ages of 2 and 17 experienced violence around the world during 2014. 1 billion children. 1 billion reasons, in my opinion, to step up, speak out, and to act. You will all recall, I imagine, the glaring omission of the protection of children from violence, exploitation, abuse, and torture in the Millennium Development Goals. That omission undoubtedly had an impact on the achievement of the goals that were in the MDGs, such as in education and health, as well as in the area of gender. A child who faces violence on the way to school will stop going to school. In the same way, success in keeping children alive in the first 5 years are lost to violence in the ensuing 10 in many parts of Central America. So those investments in early childhood are actually lost in adolescence. Violence in childhood is a stark and definitive impediment to economic and social progress. It is also a moral outrage. It's not an accident that on the 4th of January this year, the new global goals entered into force with the protection of children from violence, abuse, exploitation, and torture, an integral part of the agenda. Like-minded leaders and dedicated lobbyists and activists had a vision and were unstoppable in negotiating the right agenda for children. In Target 16.2 of the 17 goals, and in other targets beyond 16, the rallying cry is clear. We need to create a world where it is safe to be a child. The new global partnership is but one platform or means of implementation for Agenda 2030, and our intention in the partnership is to change the way that all of us, including policymakers, governments, and campaigners, think about the prevention of violence. We need to be winning the argument that societies should and can be safe for children. This partnership is based on a commitment to the rights of all children, and it's going, I hope, to turn the belief that no violence against children is justifiable, all violence is preventable, into a compelling agenda, not for talking, but an agenda for action. The partnership will serve as a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder platform, and the stakeholders are governments, civil society organizations, academic institutions, foundations, leaders of the faith-based community, the UN, and young people themselves. At the global level, so with my partnership secretariat in New York and Geneva, we will focus on building political will to end violence against children, making it a policy priority. It will also serve as a catalyst for expanding the movement to end violence, based on an understanding that there must be change in the attitudes and social norms that tolerate violence. And this can be done at all levels. But importantly, the real movement building in the partnership will take place in communities all over the world, ideally with young people, active and engaged. Civil society will be a key part of this movement that we hope to ignite. We are solutions and prevention focused in our zero draft strategy. Experts under the leadership of the World Health Organization and from a variety of sectors have come together to create an evidence-based package of interventions that have been proven effective over the last 2 decades. They include social norm change, legal and policy reform, early intervention in families, such as with the Family Nurse Visiting Program, social protection, which would be in the form of the provision of cash transfers to extremely poor families, service provision for victims, and the empowerment of children and young people. This is probably the most exciting development for our field in the last 2 decades. We've never been able to agree on a package that works. We've all used our own language, and we're now hoping to rally everybody behind this particular set of interventions. In our zero draft strategy, we introduced, and it's funny because they're trying to translate this into all kinds of languages now, but we introduced the concept of Pathfinder Countries. These are places in the world where there is demonstrated strong commitment to accelerating efforts to make children safe. In pathfinding countries, for example, partners will provide technical support to a whole-of-government approach to violence prevention, and this will involve the development of a roadmap for implementation of the package and a national commitment to increased financing. So we have an economist working with us right now on costing models for each of the strategies in that package. Catalytic funding will come from an associated trust fund. Where possible, we have a seed grant from the UK government of £40 million. We're hoping to grow the trust fund to $1 billion over the course of the next 5 years, just prior to my retirement, which many of you have been hearing about. These pathfinding countries will be demonstrating that violence can be prevented, and pathfinders will both innovate and scale up in interventions. Now, unsurprisingly, and I think we wouldn't have had a good idea if we couldn't get Sweden on board, they were our first Pathfinder country. The Prime Minister of Sweden actually stood up in a big public meeting and announced it, and he told everybody in the palace, in the presence of the Queen and King and the princesses, that he had grown up in foster care, and he has a deep commitment to making sure that the children in Sweden, both the Swedish children and the migrant children, are kept safe. We also have expressed interest from the highest levels in El Salvador, Paraguay, Mexico, and the Philippines. The partnership is in conversation with Romania, Jamaica, Tanzania, Indonesia, and of course Sri Lanka. We've also had informal discussions here in the United States, in Canada, and the UK. In 2017, most likely at the end of the year, we will host a solutions summit. Pathfinders will share experiences of what is working and what the challenges are. From that point, the partnership will continue to strengthen online and other knowledge-sharing platforms so that civil society organizations and governments can actually be talking to each other and sharing solutions. New Pathfinders may emerge. We have, for example, already been asked if regional bodies, such as the Global Movement for Children in Latin America and the South Asian Violence Against Children Initiative in South Asia, can become Pathfinders. Chicago has been in touch with us to query whether they could be a Pathfinder city. As a global platform for advocacy, the partnership will use its convening power to help expand the global movement to end violence within and between countries. And there are many efforts in existence to protect children already with which we will partner. I'm thinking of the public-private partnership Together for Girls, Girls Not Brides, the movement to end FGMC, female genital mutilation and cutting, and the Global Alliance for Children, to name but a few. We'll work with them, build on their strengths, and fortify what we hope will be an unstoppable force for change in the lives of millions of children the world over. As I mentioned already, this work will involve very strong collaboration with civil society. All governments, NGOs, foundations, and other entities can be part of the partnership in differing ways. They can support a call to action that will take place in July 2016 in New York during the high-level political forum. They can endorse the package of interventions, embrace the principles of the partnership. There are many ways to engage. As I said at the outset, Agenda 2030 is for us all, and the partnership is perhaps the first test case of its universality. Here in the United States, congressional champions for the protection of children in overseas development, in consular and trade matters, are sorely needed. Violence against children is also relevant at and within the borders of this great country. I know that the Aviel Foundation in Connecticut and Cure Violence, run by Gary Slutkin in Chicago, together with others, are calling for a White House summit on violence against children before the election this year. The partnership is supporting that call. So to everyone in this room, and especially the students of Beloit College, I want to conclude by asking that we all be inspired by the 1 billion reasons that exist to end violence, the 1 billion child victims here in the United States and everywhere in the world. Let us be buoyed along by the knowledge and evidence that violence against children can be prevented. Indeed, the solutions are in our hands, in all of our hands. Thank you once again to Beloit College, the Weissberg family, and the students and faculty who have welcomed me so warmly here. Thank you.
We'll take questions now for a few minutes. If you want to ask a question, though, we'd ask that you please get a microphone because we're live streaming and people will need to hear what the questions are.
Hi, Susan. Hi, Susan. My name is Julian. Thank you for coming. So I guess I have two questions. The first one is, why hasn't the U.S. ratified the Convention to the Rights of a Child? And the second one is, how binding is this convention to the countries that have signed?
Two excellent questions, and I'm going to start with the last one first because it's the easiest one. it's non-binding in the sense of what you would think of with a national law and it being used in court. Having said that, it is still justiciable. It is being cited in court cases. The binding nature of the convention is actually the public nature of the conversation with the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And what happens is a country reports, and then the committee offers concluding observations to the government, and that's open to the media, to the general public, and so it really becomes a kind of national conversation. I think much more could be done in that regard. To your first question, you haven't been in any of my classes, I don't think, or at least not where we talked about it, because it's come up a lot. Somalia just ratified a few months ago, and that does leave the United States. And there's so many reasons, I think, that since I think it was Bill Clinton who actually signed an intent to ratify, then it didn't get ratified. There are some misperceptions about the convention, that somehow children are going to take over the world and make all the decisions. That's one. As I said, now that I'm a parent, I have a little hesitation there. The other big issue, two other big issues in the United States, one has to do with corporal punishment and the right of families to be private about how they raise their children. That's a big one in certain parts of the country. And then the other one that I've heard quite a bit of discussion about is juvenile justice and access to justice issues. There's at least one state in this country where if you commit a crime as a child, you can be imprisoned for life without parole, which would contravene, what the convention says about that. So as my comments about public discourse at the outset, I think they really hold true here in the United States. If you could get a conversation going about this, I think that people would be less frightened by it. And I think a conversation is going to start on the 6th of April, and I hope you'll all get involved. We'll share some information about that. But there's going to be a full court press on President Obama and the First Lady to get the convention ratified.
Thank you so much for your address. My question is in regards to your mentioning of the meeting with representative of the Holy See. So I would just appreciate if you would speak a bit more about the relationship with the Vatican regarding child abuse, both within the Church and within countries where the Vatican and the Pope have an exceptional presence and influence.
A very good question. So I didn't tell you a lot of details about that meeting, but I actually didn't say anything. Protocol is such that in those meetings with the Secretary General, unless you're asked to speak, you're there as the representative of the agency, in my case, UNICEF. It was a 7-minute meeting. After 2 minutes of niceties and a little discussion about, I think there was a World Cup coming up or had just passed, there was very little time for the substance, and the Secretary General wasn't actually very comfortable with the conversation, but it kicked off a conversation. So in that regard, I think that the Church could have done a lot more, a lot quicker. But things are beginning to happen, and there really is discussion within the Church now about these issues. The head of UNICEF actually had a meeting with the Pope, I think it was last year. This was on the agenda for discussion. I don't know specifics at country level now that I'm so headquarters focused at the moment, but there's definitely the kind of discussion that needs to be starting. It's not everywhere, it's highly imperfect, but I feel quite optimistic that we'll get somewhere.
Hello. Thank you for coming. My question is, so earlier you mentioned it took 10 years to make one convention, and I'm just wondering why it took such a long time. And my second question is, did you change or adjust anything because the environment and situation around children at risk change day by day? That's
Right.
my 2 questions. Thank you.
Good. So on the first question, 10 years is actually pretty quick for the UN. And it's a complicated convention. There were lots of debates about its content. I mean, practically every article was just looked at from every possible perspective. And as I've been saying to the head of UNICEF, if you do things in a consultative process, they take time. If you go and write a law by yourself, you can do it in a couple of days, but it doesn't have the same kind of, you don't have the ownership of people in its content. So that's really the reason, but so many discussions. And to your second question, it relates to the first one. A lot of things had to be left out. Sale, prostitution, and pornography, they just couldn't agree. Children in conflict, they couldn't agree. The complaints mechanism came later, and so it's sort of why I was saying the convention's a live document. There will probably be more optional protocols. There are people right now who think the whole thing needs to be revisited. I say it's a little early for that, but it's meant to be responsive to the changing nature of our world. The other thing that the Committee on the Rights of the Child does, and you can find this, I was explaining to students today, if you go to the OHCHR, Office of the High Commission for Human Rights website, and you can search everything that has to do with the rights of children. The Committee on the Rights of the Child every once in a while will hold a day of general discussion on a topic, and then they will issue what's called a general comment. I think the last one might have been on the right to health, where they actually tackle sexual and reproductive health rights that weren't in the convention because people couldn't agree on what it should be. These are not legally binding either. They're guidance, but they're actually pretty good, and they did a great one on violence recently. It's a really good resource for your papers.
I'm going to apologize in advance for such a broad question, but I was wondering if whether or not you've seen that the international policy of the United States, or the foreign policy of the United States, has either helped or hindered your movements and actions.
It's not that it's a broad question, it's that it's a political question. Let me say that personally I have benefited from the U.S. government's, albeit poorly funded, work on orphan and vulnerable children. And the work to protect children has also benefited, don't boo me when I say this, but George Bush's PEPFAR effort, the Fund on HIV and AIDS, has had a huge and very positive impact around the world. And through that work on HIV and AIDS, we've been able to strengthen child protection systems and look at the whole issue of vulnerable children. So there are aspects of the work on foreign aid that have been extremely helpful. In my opinion, we haven't had quite enough support on the child soldier agenda. My guess is that that's going to increase with the current state of the world and concerns about security and so on, and the recruitment of young people. The other area where the U.S.'s policy has been right out there in front has been on gender-based violence and sexual violence and conflict. A tremendous amount of support, both, I would say, from embassies on the ground, but from USAID and from State Department. And then finally, on the issue that I mentioned of intercountry adoption, the U.S. ambassador on this issue has just been amazing at The Hague and in her travels around the world to put systems in place so children can be adopted at the right time, under the right conditions, for the right children, into the right families. So I could probably take this offline and talk to you about some other things that have been slightly less useful and somewhat obstructive, but I'll leave it at that.
I have a question on the adoption issue on the 1993 Hague Convention, and a terrific piece of work overall, and I really appreciate all you've done, but there have been some unintended side effects of the Hague Convention. I wonder if you could talk about that. I work on Chinese politics. We just talked today in my class on the one-child policy. Yeah. And in China, it had some effects of actually increasing child trafficking, and not all because of the convention, because of the Chinese government, but can you talk about that? And can the convention be improved?
And there's definitely room for improvement, and The Hague is open to that. And there's a big improvement I've asked for, and I will continue to push for, even though I'm out of my former role. It's somebody else's job to do it. But it's really important. And one of the biggest unintended consequences of this convention is the declaration in country after country by sovereign government of moratoriums on adoption. And what happens then is that, and I can use the Guatemala case, I could use the Nepal case, but when UNICEF really does its job, and everybody does their job, and Save the Children does their job, and we draw attention to the fact that there's corruption in the system, and it gets shut down, often, and in the case of Guatemala, there are at least 900 Guatemalan children already in process of coming to the United States, had already met birth parents, people had already invested their time, had given up their jobs, And when the moratorium gets declared, everything stops. And those kids don't go anywhere. They stay in institutions. And that has been globally, for me, the biggest negative of the Hague Convention. So what we're asking for, and Ambassador Jacobs agrees with this, but some standard operating procedures for governments who decide they're going to clean things up so that cases that are already in motion get settled before things stop. And we managed to do this effectively in Ethiopia. They were poised to declare a moratorium, I think it was about 3 years ago, and we managed to work with them, increase their social welfare capacity, and do a number of other things very swiftly. But it's a tragedy that children then get stuck in institutions for 3, 5, 7 years, or maybe never get out. And I think there are still 2 kids in Guatemala 8 years later who haven't made it to a family. So that's the downside, but I think there's a remedy for that.
Hello, Susan. My name is Kun. And then I just would like to ask you a question about, like, when you talk about children's rights, and you have worked in so many countries, so, like, how do you deal with sometimes, like, with the situation like children's rights is not defined as exactly as, like, the Western society does or something like that in different cultures? Like, how did you deal with them? Such as, like, some families choosing boys over girls, sending to schools or something like that. How do you define, like, their rights are being violated in the different cultures?
Right, and it's a great question. I think it's a little bit to the social norms issue and acknowledging that different cultures do things in different ways. But I'll start with a sort of big picture response and say that if a country ratifies the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they're signaling an intent to do something with the text domestically. It doesn't mean they're going to radically alter certain practices overnight, but it definitely signifies something. I'm not naive when it comes to certain governments who sign everything and do nothing. But the role of UNICEF, and I think at the heart of your question, the role of UNICEF is we're not the world's police. We don't tell people what to do. We work with local organizations. We work with local organizations that have the intelligence on the ground, that understand the culture. And the point I mentioned about the NGO in Bangladesh was just that there's nowhere I've been where there aren't already people tackling the same issues we care about that we can partner with. And so I think if the images of the UN and the blue helmets and going around, it's not how we're much more subtle, we're much more community-based, and we work where we can. There are some things that we just can't tackle head on, but maybe some movie star in the community is able to make an announcement and have an impact. Maybe it's a leader of the faith-based community who can actually get people to listen to him or her. So there are lots of ways to sort of get around some of those challenges, but it's not, I don't want to make it sound easier than it is. Also, I mean, one of the practices right now, child marriage, we've got more money to work on child marriage than we've ever had. There's a 12-country program that is very generously funded by governments for the next 3 or 4 years. Can we end child marriage in that period of time? Absolutely not. I mean, we're up against some deep cultural practices. We're up against populations that are poor and running from war, for whom child marriage is a practice to protect kids. You're marrying off your girls so that they're safe. So your question's a very important one. I think the only thing I would sort of conclude with is it's not so much that these are just Western values. I haven't lived or worked anywhere where even the poorest of poor families didn't love their children and want what's best for them. And I think it's really good for us to maybe think about that. Yes, lots of people do horrible things to their kids, but by and large, you will hear parents say they want their children safe, they want them to have food, and they want them above all else to go to school, to have a better life. So, and if you come on Friday, you'll see a lot of that in the film. It comes through very strongly. Thanks for your question.
Hi, my name is Lydia. I know this isn't a really cut and dried issue, but what is UNICEF's position on the role of child soldiers as both victims and perpetrators?
We have a very strongly held position insofar as we support the use of the guidelines that the UN developed on children as witnesses and victims in procedures, legal, criminal, and other. And that, of course, defines children as under the age of 18 and so on. The position gets a little less clear when we're talking about 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. But we did stay with Almar Khadr right to the end on that particular case where he was detained in Guantanamo. He was a child when those crimes were committed. In fact, the legal office of UNICEF submitted an amicus brief on his behalf. So the organization is pretty clear on where we stand. It's murky for many governments, as you probably know.
We can take one more question.
Howdy. Hi, my name's Emma. I'm a senior IR major. I met you yesterday at the dinner. We talked a lot about gender-based violence against children, and I was wondering if there's a conversation at UNICEF, especially in this new convention initiative, about violence against girls at school or while they're going to school and protecting that educational right.
Yeah, I mean, there is. It's a huge, I actually think that in the partnership, if we can partner with, there's a global partnership on education, there's the global movement to protect education from attack, there are all these big things going on in education, and it's where a lot of money is going right now, that we could actually piggyback on a lot of those efforts. And I'll do a little shout out for Plan International. Their whole focus is girls' education and keeping girls safe. So it's a hugely important one. The only thing I'll say about this is that we also want in the partnership to acknowledge that boys experience violence too, and that young people that are identifying as LGBTQ also face violence. So we want to cover sort of every kid. But importantly, you're right, when it comes to school, girls and violence is a big issue, including sexual violence at the hands of their teachers.
We have one final thing we need to do with Susan before she goes.
That sounds ominous.
So can I borrow this for a second, Susan? Yeah, so thanks everybody. The success of the Weissberg family vision is the attraction of a Weissberg resident scholar who draws energy and endurance from a community unreservedly enthused about the potential of learning so much from a full week with a person of such consequence. Our Weissberg scholars are international, interdisciplinary, and indefatigable. They live engaged in consequential lives. They have been engaged with consequential issues, engaged with consequential principles, engaged with consequential decision makers. The Weissberg chair is maybe the most uncomfortable chair in higher education. Only 50% of her way through this gauntlet. Susan can attest, I suspect, to our lofty expectations regarding her energy. When Ali Alawi held the Weissberg chair in 2010-11, he remarked that he had more contact with more students in a week at Beloit College than he experienced in a semester at Harvard. We ask a shocking amount of Dr. Susan Bissell. We ask so much because our students, our faculty, our community, we are hungry, voracious, ravenous for the connections to these Weissberg chairs. And our attention, Susan, has been riveted on you. Your time is well spent on this community. Marvin Weissberg's vision predicts and demands this. You have been the embodiment of Mr. Weissberg's vision. Already, you have been an exemplar of what it means to be a Weissberg chair. In recognition and in appreciation of you and your time here, it is my pleasure to present to you a token of our appreciation. You come up here, Susan, for a second. This token, which includes an image that is particularly meaningful to this community, a turtle. Do you like turtles, Susan? Of course you do. This is an image that is intended to remind you every time you look at it that you are a Beloiter. We claim you as a Beloiter, and we hope you embrace your future as a Beloiter. Here you go, Susan. Yeah, the turtle is actually a bribe to keep you here for the rest of the week, so we hope it works. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. I intend to go home and call my children. Good night.